Okay, we have a bit of a ground to cover. We are on Chaf Amud Beis, Chaf Amud Beis 20b1, and we are at the first column, second paragraph. We're going to kind of tie up a bunch of loose ends. Because there are a bunch of contradictions that need to be addressed. The basic logic behind these contradictions is in many ways review of many of the things we've seen until now. So it's not really, we're not going to cover too much new conceptual ground, but really just pull together a couple of different ideas. Okay, so Rav Chisda, Rami Pischa Apischa. Rav Chisda contrasted two different teachings of Rav Yeshua concerning Pesach. Umeshani, and then he resolved the contradiction. So Rav Chisda begins by asking the following: Mi am Rav Yeshua shtem ka'achas. Okay, so in our Mishnah, which began, that kickstarted this whole entire discussion, we had, and listen close, we had Rav Yossi quoting Rav Yeshua. Okay, Rav Yossi quoting Rav Yeshua. Okay, Rav Yossi the Tana quoting Rav Yeshua the Tana, who said that suspended chametz, meaning of truma, so basically you had something which is possibly tameh, you have truma which is maybe tameh, and he said it could be burnt with something which is definitely tameh. It could be burnt with chametz which is definitely tameh. Again, Rav Yossi said that chametz which is maybe tameh is allowed to be burnt with chametz which is definitely tameh prior to on Erev Pesach. Okay, that's something Rav Yossi said, that Rav Yeshua said in the name of Rav Yossi, okay? Or Raminu, but we have a brisa which seems to say not like that. Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi says as follows: Ein anida dom l'raya. Rav Yossi over there is we're catching a mid discussion. Rav Meir had just said something in this brisa, and Rav Yossi counters Rav Meir's statement, and he says in anida dom l'raya that you're not making a proper analogy. And then he continues and he says, She'idu Rabbeinu, when we had a testimony that we received about what took place in the Beis Hamikdash by the Kohanim, Amaha'idu, what did they testify about? Im alabasar shnitma. If you want to say that they testified about meat that was contaminated by a derived tuma, okay, which is right of vlada tuma, the second degree of tuma, together with meat which was contaminated by avatuma, meaning first degree tuma being burnt with second degree tuma, zetame v'zetame. So there in the Beis Hamikdash, the case that we're describing is something where both are tame, second degree and first degree, and they said they burnt them together. Okay, fine. And if you want to tell me that the Kohanim, the testimony, the thing that they did in the Beis Hamikdash that was being described was that they took oil that was of truma that became unfit, okay, meaning it's puzzle because it came into contact with someone who had a low degree of tuma, that was burnt in a lamp, that was lit in a lamp that was contaminated by someone who is tame from a corpse. In other words, the lamp is a rishon l'tuma, so zeh puzzle, that's tame. Again, even in that case, the oil is pasul, okay? It's the lowest degree of tameh. It's tameh. It's so light in its tumah that it's only invalid. It can't contaminate something else. But again, it's invalid, and the lamp itself is tameh. Okay. However, we agree. But truma shenit based bevlada tuma. If we're talking about truma that was contaminated by a derived truma, shestarfan osama truma shenit based by avatuma, to be burned together with truma that was contaminated by avatuma. In other words, first degree and second degree together. We, says Rav Yossi, I have no problem with that. But how could we go ahead and burn truma which is potentially tameh, safek tameh, together with something which is definitely tameh? Shema yavo li'elahu v'tarim. Eliyahu Navi might come and tell us that this thing which we are in doubt about is actually tahar, right? So bottom line is, that's the end of the quote of Rav Yossi. And Rav Yossi in the statement makes it very clear that he is unaware of anyone who goes ahead and allows for the burning of safek tuma together with definite tuma. The problem is in our Mishnah, here in Pesachim, he says explicitly that Rav Yeshua says you're allowed to burn together safek tuma together with definite tuma, right? So on the one hand, in the Mishnah, he says, he's quoting Rav Yeshua who says that you're allowed to burn doubtful together with definite. And in this brisa, he's dismissing the notion. He says, no one says, he's talking to Rav Meir, he says, no one says that, and yet he himself quoted Rav Yeshua saying that. So what's going on? So where it says, Mishani, Harab Shimon V'Alib Rav Yeshua. In the Mishnah, it's Rav Shimon according to Rav Yeshua, okay? Harav Yossi V'Alib Rav Yeshua, okay? And in the brisa, it's Rav Yossi, Rav Yossi's understanding Rav Yeshua, where he understands Rav Yeshua would not allow such a thing. Now the Gemara is obviously going to ask in a second, wait, in our Mishnah also, it's not Rav Shimon quoting Rav Yeshua, it's actually Rav Yossi quoting Rav Yeshua. So, Rav Yossi was the one who was the author of the statement in our Mishnah. So we'll come back to that. But the point is that we're trying to say that there are two versions of what Rav Yeshua actually says. Okay, to Tanya. And we have a brisa that says this explicitly, we're at 20b2. Let's say you have Erev Pesach, which falls out on Shabbos. Okay, Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos like this This past year? Yeah, this past year, right? Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos. Mivarnes Hakol Lefnei Shabbos. You have to burn everything before Shabbos, right? V'sarfin Trumos Tameos Tluyos Utahoros Divrei Meir. Rabbi Meir says you burn everything together. That is Tameh, and that is Safek Tameh, and that is Tahar. You put them all together in one fire on Friday, and you burn them all together. Divrei Meir, that's Rabbi Meir's words. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Tahor B'nei Atzma, Utzlu B'nei Atzma, Utmei B'nei Atzma. Rabbi Yossi says no, nothing can be burnt together. You have one fire for all that is pure chametz, pure it's tahar. You have one pile for things which are tamei chametz, tamei truma chametz, and you have one pile for things which are maybe. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon says no. Lo nechlu Rabbi Yezer Yeshua al haTorah al tameya she'ein sarfin. Rabbi Yezer Yeshua never disagreed about tahar and tamei. He agreed that if one is tahar, one you have chametz which is truma tahora, and chametz which is truma tameya, separate, because one is definite. They're both definite. Definitely tahar, definitely tamei. They're separate. Alatzliya about tahora and shesorfin, and they both agree that if you have something which is maybe tamei and something which is definitely tahar, you could burn them together. Amanechliku, what do they argue about? Alatzliya about tamei. They argued about things which are suspended tuma and tamei. In other words, safek and tamei. Sure, Rabbi Yezer Omer Tisarav Zova Atzma Zova Atzma. Rabbi Yezer says they should be burned separately. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Shtem Ka'achas, and Rabbi Yeshua says that they should be burned together. Okay, so basically, what you see from this brisa is Rav Shimon is telling us that Rabbi Yeshua holds that when something is maybe safek tamei, it gets to be burned with something which is definite tamei. And we saw Rav Yossi saying no, even when it's safek, the safek is burned separate from that is tahar and from that is tamei. It's all burned separately. Ask the Gemara the question we alluded to before. V'masnis Rav Yossi. The problem is our Mishnah is a quote from Rav Yossi. Rav Yossi is the one telling us Rav Yeshua holds. So Gemara says Hachiyam Rav Yossi the Rav Meir. This is Rav Yossi meant to say to Rav Meir. Afilu Rav Shimon v'alibid Rav Yeshua. Rav Yossi is saying like this. I hold, Rav Yeshua holds that things which are safek and things which are tamei cannot be burnt together. But there is an opinion of Rav Shimon who is more lenient, and Rav Shimon in the view of Rav Yeshua, who is more lenient than me, Mekel, who has a more lenient stance, and still, Ki Mekel, Betluya Utmeya. And even Rav Shimon, according to Rav Yeshua, who is more lenient than me, all he allows for is burning potential, like safek tamei, together with definite tamei, aval b'tahora utmei alone, but he does not allow burning tahar together with tamei. Fine, so the bottom line is what comes out over here is there are two opinions. So Rav Yossi acknowledges that there are two ways to understand Rav Yeshua. There's his interpretation of Rav Yeshua, who basically is telling us that that you cannot burn anything. Safek is separate, tahar is separate, tamei is separate. They're all burned separately. And then we have Rav Shimon in Rav Yeshua who holds that no, safek is together with tamei. Either way, Rav Yossi turns to Rav Meir who says that tahar, tamei, and safek all go together. He says no one allows for tahar and tamei together. At the very most, they allow safek to go together with one of those, but not definite tahar and tamei. Okay, and therefore we've resolved the contradiction there. Okay, now the Gemara asks another contradiction. Rav Yossi, Rav Chanina, Rav Truma, Pescha. Rav Yossi and Rav Chanina contrast the rule of Rav Yeshua regarding truma. And regarding Pesach, Umeshani, and he resolves it. So what's the question? Mi Rav Yeshua shtenka achas. Did Rav Yeshua actually say that safek truma tameya is to be burnt with definite truma tameya, right? That potential, if you have truma, which is maybe tamei and it's chametz, did Rav Yeshua really say that can be burnt with truma tameya? Okay, uraminu. We have a problem. There's a contradiction. Okay, because. And all these quotes should be somewhat familiar. Chavish al truma should know ba safek tuma. Let's say you have a cask of truma wine that you have a suffix. There's a doubt. Maybe it became tummy. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer. So again, you have, let's say, a cask of wine of truma that's sitting in a room, and a tummy person walks through that room, and you come running in after that person, like, hey, did he touch the wine? Did he not touch the wine? You have a suffix. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Ma'aseh Munachas B'Kam Torfa. Rabbi Eliezer says, if it was lying in an exposed area, okay, Yanicher Makam Mutzna. Even if it was exposed, and when the guy walked in, the tummy guy walked in, go cover it, because we have to still be concerned that maybe it's still tahar. Okay, Vim Haisa Megula, and if it was uncovered, Chasana, go cover it now. Rabbi Yeshua says the opposite. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Im Haisa Menachas Makam Mutzna. If it was in the corner, Yanichenu Makam Turfa. Now you could go ahead and leave it in an exposed area. Vim Haisa Mechusa, and if it was covered, you're allowed to uncover it. But what do we see from the statement of Rabbi Yeshua? Grama in, b'yadayim lo. All Rabbi Yeshua did not say you could go and be mitame it now. All he said is you could uncover it or leave it in the middle. He says you're allowed to cause it to become tameh, but he doesn't say you could be metame it, you could go and actively make it tame. And yet in our Mishnah, what does he say? Burn together chametz truma tameya with chametz truma of safek, and burn them together. Whoa, that's a whole different story. That is actively causing one to become tame. So the Gemara says 20b3, Mashani, we answer, Harav Shimon Rav Yeshua. No, one is Rav Shimon according to Rav Yeshua, who takes a more lenient view of Rav Yeshua's approach and says that yes, he would even allow it to happen biyadayim. You'd even be allowed to be metamiyat actively. Harav Yossi Rav Yeshua, whereas Rav Yossi according to Rav Yeshua takes the more lenient approach. Okay, another contradiction we're now going to suggest. Now we're going to ask a contradiction from within Truma. Umashani and Rav Lazar answers the contradiction. Rav Yeshua grama in biyadayim lo. Did Rav Yeshua really say, at least according to one approach, that you're only allowed to cause it to become suffix truma, to become tameh, but not do it actively with your hands? However, Ramina, we ask from the following Mishnah. Chavish al truma shishbra begas al yona. Right, when we had the case of the truma cask of wine that breaks in the upper vat of a wine press, v'tachtona v'tachteh chulin tameim, and beneath it, in the lower place, there is tamei truma, right? Disaster. Person has a huge vat, full of wine, okay, and the wine is tamei, and above you have truma, which you set aside for the Kohen, and then that casket, it has a hole in it. It starts pouring out and starts breaking apart and starts pouring out into the thing below. So Moder, Eliezer of Rabbi Yeshua, Eliezer of Yeshua both agree. Shem yachal hatzal men revias betara. If you're able to run into the other room and get a casket which is pure and come back and you'll be able to catch at least a revias of the truma, then you have to do that. Okay, yatzil. Then you have to save it, even though you're going to lose out in the other truma that falls and ruins the chulin, the stuff below. You still have to do it. Vim lav. But if you were to go ahead and go get a casket which is pure, right, tahar, and by the time you come back, you wouldn't even be able to save a revius of truma, then Eliezer Omer tervitz tameh. Eliezer says you have to let it spill out. You can't do anything. Don't contaminate with your hands. You are allowed to go ahead and catch it with a tameh bucket, even though by catching it in a tameh bucket, you are directly causing that truma to be tameh. Again, why are you catching it with a tameh bucket? To save it from falling into the stuff below, right? So, but he says you're allowed to cause it to become tameh with your hands, right? So again, in this Mishnah that we just read by Truma, he allows you to contaminate Truma actively, whereas in the Brisa above, when you had the guy walking through that room, he says you can uncover it, but you can't go ahead and cause a sheret. You can't put a sheret in it. You can't cause it to become tummy directly. Umeshani Belezer says no contradiction. Shani Hasam Dika Hefset Chulin. He says no. There's a difference. He says there's a difference. In one case, you're saving a loss. You're preventing a loss. So Rabbi Yeshua is going to be more lenient. In the other case, okay, you have this bucket, the barrel that maybe was tamei, but you're not saving anything, and therefore there's a difference. Okay. Maskava Rava Masnisa Nami Ika Hefset. Remember we had this dialogue earlier. He says, wait a second. In our Mishnah also, if you want to tell me Rabbi Yeshua is lenient whenever there is a loss, then why in our Mishnah? In our Mishnah also, there is a loss, okay? And there is a loss in the sense that you have to make two separate fires. You have to make a fire for the tahar, the suffix, the maybe tameh, and the definite tameh, according to Rav Yossi's version of Rav Yeshua, and yet in this Bryce over here, when there's a loss, he allows actively being mitamias, right? So again, the contradiction is in the Brisa by the barrel. He allowed to prevent a loss. He says, "Go take that tamei bucket and catch it." Whereas in our Mishnah's case of burning chametz before Pesach, even though there is a loss, because if you have to burn them separately, right? Okay, so you remember the Gemara. Good. It's a god. Anyone else remember the Gemara? Okay, so when you have to burn them separately, right? So there's a loss. 50 pieces of wood over here, 50 pieces of wood over here. I have to spend extra wood, right? And Rabbi Yeshua's, Rabbi Yossi's version of Rabbi Yeshua says you have to burn them separately. So Gemara answers, "I'm le'abayah lehav some chashu, lehav some chashu." Right? Remember this, all right? He says for a big loss, we're going to be concerned. A big loss is you have a vat of wine and it's getting ruined. That's a lot of money. As opposed to 50 twigs, 25 twigs. How many twigs do you need to make a little fire? Okay, shkayach, it's a little bit of loss. That we're not going to be concerned about. Ask the Gemara, Tamra, where do we see the source? They'll have some meruba chashu that we are concerned for a big loss. They'll have some mu'ala chashu, and for a small loss, we're not concerned about. In other words, what basis do we have to make this distinction? In other words, logically, we understand there's obviously a distinction, but do we have any actual textual source that such a distinction exists? So the Gemara says, yes, the Tanya, chavish al shemen truma shnishma v'gas al yona. If let's say you have a truma oil that broke in the upper vat. Now we're talking about oil. Okay, so v'tachtona chulin tmein, and in the bottom one there is chulin, regular stuff, right? Chol from North Chol, right? That is tameh. So the truma that's going to go into it is going to cause all of the stuff below to become forbidden. Moder Eliezer Vishur, Eliezer agrees to Rabbi Yeshua. And I would just point out that the terminology here is a little bit funny. It should really say Yeshua agrees to Eliezer. We'll come back to that question later on. That if you're able to save even one, if you're able to save one revius in a state of tahara, then you should yatzel. You should do so. In other words, if you have one pure tahar, canister or whatever, then you're able to save that oil, you should do so. Vim la, but if you're not able to do so, terevit tatame, both Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer, even Rabbi Yeshua normally said you could go ahead and be metame biyadayim, you could catch the wine with your hands. When it comes to oil, he says, you're allowed to go, you can't save it. You're not allowed to put the oil directly into a tameh barrel. You're not allowed to do so. Right? So we see that when oil truma is about to fall into truma oil is about to fall into tamei chulin, there he says you cannot save it actively, whereas by the wine he did. Now the Gemara is going to go into analysis of what the difference between oil and wine is. It's not because one's expensive, one's not, as I imagine many of us would have thought. The Gemara is going to have a different answer. But the point is that what's going to come out is that the loss of oil is going to be less of a loss, and therefore even Rabbi Yeshua says there you can't save it. Right? There you can't go ahead and catch it directly with the tamei barrel because you're going to be metame biyadayim and it's a small loss. Whereas with the wine, which is a big loss, then he says you could do so. But you see that distinction made in this mission over here. The Gemara asks, what's the difference between the oil? Because even when it's tamei, you're still able to use that oil to light a fire for you. You wouldn't be able to go tamei oil, tamei truma oil. You could still, even if it's tamei, when it's wine, there's really almost nothing you can do with the wine. When it's oil that's tamei, you could go ahead, you can't consume something that's tamei. You can still benefit from the tamei, and therefore you can still light a fire with it. So yainami, you might ask with wine also, you're ziluf. It's allowed. You can use it for sprinkling. What that means is that back in the day they didn't have those plug-in things which put all that good smell out, or different ways of, what are those things called? Yeah, air freshener. There's like the fancy one that everyone uses. I don't know what it's called. I don't know. Whatever. Okay. No, none of us are fancy. Okay. Good. What's it called? The point is that they had the air freshener. Wine. They used to sprinkle wine. That was their air freshener back in the day. Okay. Yainami or laziluf. So Gemara says no. V'chitim is ziluf lav milsa. If you want to say that, no, sprinkling, using it for an air freshener, that's not so significant. It says the opposite. Shosim elog besela. One should drink wine, which you could purchase a log. A log is a measurement for a sela, 1 coin. Umizalfim log shtayim. And if you want to use it for an air freshener, you should buy a more expensive wine. In other words, air freshener wine is actually more expensive wine. Go figure. Okay? So the Gemara says, no, bechadash. We're dealing with a reservoir of new wine, and since it didn't age yet, it's not used for air freshener. It's only older wine which starts to smell stronger, right? So older wine starts to smell fine. Gemara says, okay, so shkayach, it's new right now. But put it in your cellar, put on a sign on an air freshener, let it sit around, and eventually be able to use it. So Gemara says, no, asti beili data color. You're gonna mess up. If you keep it in your cellar, one day you're gonna come, you're gonna be thirsty, you're gonna be a little absent-minded, maybe drink too much, you're gonna start pouring some wine from that keg, and you're gonna drink it. That's a real problem. Okay? So Gemara says, shemanami asti beili data color. The oil also. You might also come to the same mistake. You could only use this oil for a fire. You can't use it for dressing, right, or for making fried fish or whatever, right? So the Gemara says no. The Gemara says rami le bichlemos. With the oil, what you'll do is you'll put it in a disgusting type of vessel, and therefore preventing you from actually using it for food purposes. The Gemara says yainami rami le bichlemos. So the wine also put it in a disgusting vessel. The Gemara says l'ziluf kabayile. You want to use it for sprinkling. Bichlemos rami le. The whole thing of sprinkling is it has to develop nicely. If you put it in a disgusting vessel, it's going to lose. It's going to prevent it from having that nice smell, and therefore, obviously, a person's not going to do so. And therefore, with wine, we're concerned a person's going to go ahead and use it, even though it's usher to use. Ask the Gemara now. This notion of being afraid of having something like, are you allowed to have a substance in your house which potentially could be misused? That is machlokas tanaim. Let's see. Let's see. At a cask of truma, the wine became tamei. Beishamei omrim tishafei chaval. You should go ahead and pour it all out. If you have wine that is tamei, pour the whole thing out. Beis Shammai says because we're afraid you're going to go ahead and use it. Beisol omrim tasa ziluf. You're allowed to use it for sprinkling. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi comes along and says, I'm going to find a compromise view between them. Besadet shafei chaval. If it would happen in the field that it became tameh, spill it out, because you don't use air fresheners in the field. And by the time you get home, you may get thirsty and may drink it. But if it was in the house, you're allowed to use it for sprinkling. Igida Amri, a different version. In the case of new wine, Rabbi Shmuel son of Rabbi Yossi says, spill it out, because you're going to have to sit in your cellar for a while till it ages. But if it's aged, then you're allowed to use it for sprinkling. Amrlo, they said to him, 21a1, your opinion does not tip the balance. In other words, this is not a compromise opinion, because in truth, these are really Rabbi Shammai V'Sel, who says they're really just arguing about this discussion about whether a person is going to by mistake use it, whether or not, and therefore your compromise seems to be somewhere in the middle. We don't actually know what the basis for Rabbi Shammai V'Sel's opinions are, and therefore your compromise is not a good compromise. This is going further. Rav Yosef Bar Chanina machlokesh nafla lepachos mimea sa'achulin temein. Okay, we're going to have to stop over here. I'm sorry, I thought we'd finish. We're almost going to finish. Tomorrow we're going to start a new Mishnah, start a new parak, God willing, but we'll pick up then. Have a great day.